Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we will critically evaluate the popular slogan, Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We will examine whether this statement is philosophically sound, whether it is consistently applied, and whether it fairly evaluates historical claims such as the resurrection of Jesus. So let's just go ahead and talk about this popular slogan. So, this popular slogan is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This slogan is frequently invoked in debates about miracles and theism. It is often presented as if it were a scientific rule, often applied to miracles and the resurrection. This is common in skeptical arguments. Most commonly with atheists, they will bring up this slogan that resurrection or the miracles in the Bible, they are extraordinary claims. So this kind of a claims require extraordinary evidence. However, before accepting this, we must ask what it means and whether it is true or not. So let's just go ahead and examine this slogan philosophically. Now, is this a scientific principle? Can miracles or resurrection be tested in laboratory? No. Derived from experiment. We cannot do an experiment to prove that resurrection actually happened. So this slogan is not a scientific discovery. It cannot be verified by experiment or observation. Instead, it is a philosophical claim about how beliefs should function. Therefore, it must be defended philosophically rather than assumed. So let's just go ahead and try to examine this claim. So what does extraordinary mean? So extraordinary means beyond what is usual or regular, something which is uncommon or rare. Maybe it's supernatural. So the term extraordinary is ambiguous. Does it mean improbable, rare, miraculous, unexpected? So unless it's clearly defined, the slogan lacks precision and can be applied arbitrarily. Now, is the slogan self-defeating? So the slogan that an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence, that itself is self-defeating because you are trying to make a claim that an extraordinary claim requires an extraordinary evidence. So what is the evidence for that? What does it mean by extraordinary? So the slogan itself is a sweeping claim. It makes a universal epistemic demand. What extraordinary evidence supports it? So the claim appears extraordinary because it proposes a universal rule for belief. If extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, what extraordinary evidence supports this claim? Because you are already making an extraordinary claim. So you need an evidence to support it. But what extraordinary evidence can support this claim? If none of the evidence is provided, then the slogan may undermine itself. So here we can see that this slogan itself is self-defeating. Now, if extraordinary means miraculous, so a miracle would require another miracle to prove it. So how are you going to prove this miracle? Because it's not scientific. You cannot repeat it in a laboratory or by any scientific experiment. So a miracle would require another miracle to prove it. And that leads to an infinite regress. Miracles could never be believed in that way. So if extraordinary evidence means miraculous confirmation, then a miracle would require another miracle to verify it, and that second miracle would require a third miracle, and so on infinitely. This standard guarantees disbelief regardless of evidence. Now, if extraordinary means repeatable, so historical events are not repeatable. Something that happened in history, for example, the history of Napoleon Bonaparte, or whether George Washington existed. So that is an historical claim. We need to check the historical records. We need to check the eyewitness accounts And based on that, we can prove whether the person existed in history or not. So, historical events are not repeatable. If extraordinary evidence means laboratory repeatability, then no historical events could ever be known. Your birth cannot be repeated because it only happened one time. The Big Bang cannot be repeated because it only happened one time. And most of the atheists or most of the scientists, they accept the Big Bang theory for the origin of the universe. But this event itself cannot be repeated. So, history is accessed through testimony and evidence, not through experimental repetition. Now, you need proper historical evaluation for the historical claims. So, historical reasoning uses criteria such as early documentation, multiple attestation, eyewitness accounts, explanatory coherence, right? So, early sources, eyewitness testimony, independent corroboration, explanatory power. So, the resurrection should be evaluated using historical standard and not the scientific or laboratory testing doesn't work in the miracle claims or the claims like resurrection. So, someone who say that extraordinary claim require extraordinary evidences, what you need is a good historical evaluation, just like any other claims about history, that you need an eyewitness testimony or early sources to prove that this person existed or the resurrection actually happened. Now, there is a difference between proof versus persuasion. You can give proof and you can give evidences, but the proof does not guarantee persuasion. There is a difference between the logical proof and psychological persuasion. People may reject your conclusion not because evidence is lacking, but because they are unwilling to accept the implications. People's worldview can influence their belief. People can resist the conclusion. So that's the difference between giving a proof and psychological persuasion. Now, there is an inconsistency problem in this slogan. Big Bang, as we see, people accept it without repeatability. Many skeptics accept the singular origin events such as Big Bang without demanding the repeatability. The multiverse hypothesis is often invoked without direct evidence. This suggests inconsistency in applying the slogan. So they don't apply this to Big Bang or the multiverse universe. They just accept this claim without any evidences. So this is inconsistency problem with this slogan. When it comes to resurrection or the miracles in the Bible, they would like to apply that you have to give an extraordinary evidences to support your claim. But that's not consistently true when we see some of the other events that the skeptic accept without extraordinary evidences. Now, there is a ground of truth and reason. If objective truth exists, it must be grounded in something eternal. Augustine, he argued that truth ultimately resides in mind of God. Without such grounding, rationality itself becomes questionable. So we can see some of the questions like, why does logic work? Why can mind grasp reality? So the truth is grounded in the eternal mind, as Augustine argued. So without such grounding, rationality itself becomes questionable. Let's just summarize what we discussed in this video. So the slogan is philosophical. The extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It is philosophical and it's not scientific. When examined carefully, it is often undefined and inconsistently applied, as we have seen in the case of Big Bang or multiverse universe. There are many claims that the skeptic accept without extraordinary evidence. A good evidence is sufficient. For the claims like resurrection, we can check the early eyewitness account and individual testimony, and based on evidence, we can conclude that the resurrection actually happened or the crucifixion actually happened. Theism explains order and rationality. Historical claims like resurrection and miracles, they require sufficient evidence appropriate to their nature, not an undefined demand for extraordinary proof. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding this slogan that the skeptic use, that an extraordinary claim requires an extraordinary evidence, and they primarily use this against theism. They will use it against Christianity. Whenever we talk about resurrection or other miracles in the Bible, they would demand an extraordinary evidences from us. But when we look at this slogan philosophically and examine it, as we have discussed in this video, all we need is a good evidence to support the historical claim. And this slogan is very inconsistently when you applied it to the other claims that the people made throughout the history. The historical claims requires only the sufficient evidence which is appropriate to the nature and does not need an extraordinary proof. I hope this episode has helped you understanding this slogan. An extraordinary claims requires an extraordinary proof or evidence. Thank you and God bless.